much. Good evening. I'm Ann Gordon Curran, and I have been responsible for the speakers for the professional lecture series. Tonight we have Dr. Carrie Collier. Dr. Collier has been working on a family unit functioning questionnaire, which is grounded in Bowen family systems theory. She's also using Dr. Daniel Paparo's family systems model for assessment, on which he has presented in 2018 and 2020. Dr. Collier is using her skills as a psychologist to try to get more factual data about the earmarks that demonstrate the flow of emotional reactivity and activity among family members. She'll be covering the research design, model, and results, as well as the relevant uses and pitfalls of this questionnaire in her work with families. Dr. Collier's journey to this point began with a master's in rehabilitation counseling obtained in 1999 from the University of South Carolina School of Medicine. She then worked in the emergency department as a licensed professional counselor. She moved to Washington, D.C., where she obtained a PhD in counseling from George Washington University, and while there worked on her clinical training at the Bowen Center. She then attended the postgraduate program at the center from 2007 to 2010 and was appointed to a position as associate faculty in 2013 and served on the center's board in 2018. I have heard her say that she never intended to be a therapist because she decided that research was more her bent. But as she learned Bowen theory, her professional life shifted to a focus on researching the family unit, as the theory made so much sense to her. She also was director of the online program beginning in 2016 and has served on the editorial team of the Bowen Center's Family Systems Journal since 2018. As a research focus, she's been working on parenting in family systems and the family systems responses to challenges. The resulting behavior is the catalyst for seeing the emotional system in action, so tracking that data is one of her goals. This challenging effort requires a creative mind and a lot of industry and effort to see what can be accomplished to pin down more factual information on how human emotions work in intense family relationship systems. Dr. Collier has taught courses at several universities locally, Marymount in the Counseling and Forensic Psychiatry Department, Trinity Washington in the Department of Counseling and Human Development, and as adjunct faculty at George Washington University in the Department of Counseling and Human Development. Since July, she officially became the new director of the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family and has had a rather remarkable year of reorienting her focus to a broader sense of running a dynamic center, which includes a clinical program, research groups, several levels of education programs, and the administrative duties of budget, hiring of staff and faculty, and attempting to remain sane all at one time. She also is married and has a young son who does not hesitate to remind her that he exists. Let's welcome Dr. Collier as she presents on the Family Unit Functioning Questionnaire. Good evening.
Thank you, Anne. And I also want to thank and recognize your efforts. You've been putting these lecture series together. They're usually held at the center in Georgetown in person in the evenings. And Anne Curran has been doing this for about 9 years. And next year, Kathleen Smith will do it. But I just wanted to recognize Anne Curran's efforts and the over the 9 years of putting this together and then shifting to online. So thank you, Anne. And I'm not sure that I'm still sane. So I'm going to get started. Let me share my screen here. And can everyone see that? Is that good? Okay, good. Thank you. So This evening, I am going to first move these pictures over here. This evening, I'm going to be talking about the family response to challenges. And this is a questionnaire that I developed to develop a questionnaire. So it's testing Dr. Dan Paparo's systems model for family assessment. And so the study that I'm going to be talking about is basically from the beginning of when I started looking into this, how to test the model, and then where it ended up. So I'll be taking you through the stages of that, and hopefully not boring you along the way. So this is one of my sort of go-to quotes when I think about family challenges. And I think this year has been a wonderful opportunity to observe families, my own family, but also families that I work with in my coaching practice and in the clinic, and just families that are around me. I have a young child. I talk to a lot of other parents, engage other people in the community, and COVID has really put a lot of different challenges and a spin on a lot of ways that families are functioning. So this has been a wonderful opportunity year that has been burdened with challenges, but also an opportunity for me as a researcher and an observer of my own family to really look at how families are responding in today's world. But I started thinking about this before that, and so I'm just going to read this quote, and this is in Dr. Bowen's book. Here's a picture of his book on page 85. So this is in the beginning of his chapters where he was looking at families with schizophrenia. So it's in the beginning of his book. So in my opinion, these families are not really helpless. He's talking about families with a child with schizophrenia. They are functionally helpless. The parents are adequate, resourceful people in their outside relationships. It is in relationship to each other that they become functionally helpless. So at this time that he is saying this, there's a real focus on why are children of really sort of successful looking people coming up with schizophrenia. This was sort of a focus in that time when he was studying it, of how is this happening? And he sort of puts it on this, he puts a completely different lens on, which is, yeah, these people can do well in their jobs and can maybe play golf and take tennis and, cook wonderful meals. But there's something functionally helpless about when they begin to relate and posture to one another in the relationships. And so this sort of positions people, I think, with a level of hope that if it's not so much a family that is completely not able to figure the problem out. It's really looking at the family in a functionally helpless state, and how can one look for the leader in the family, or how can one think about who can rise up out, or how many people can think about the problem and maybe make some changes. So he goes on to say, when the family is able to be a contained unit and there is a family leader with motivation to define the problem and to back his own convictions in taking appropriate action, the family can change from a directionless, anxiety-ridden, floundering unit to a more resourceful organism. So he calls the family an organism with a problem to be solved. So I just think about this year with COVID, how were families able, who looked like a family leader at times? Which families was it easier to identify the family leader, or different people that took on the leadership at different times? And who and what did the families look like where it wasn't as obvious who the leader was, or who was really taking charge and having behaviors that were grounded in his or her own purpose and meaning, in his or her own convictions, he calls it. So this is a way that I think sort of grounds me for tonight in thinking about how families respond to challenges. And I'm going to talk more about this. So I just wanted to situate everyone in this sort of different way of thinking that Bowen had at that time. And how do we look for family leaders? I invite you in the audience to think about family leaders. What does functionally helpless look like in a family? I think it looks different in a lot of families. I think it can be variations. But a functionally helpless family, what does that look like? For maybe an example would be during COVID, two parents who were working full-time from home and their child couldn't go to school. And so now they're having to manage work at home, the relationships, the intensity potentially in the relationships that were normally softened by getting out of the house and doing one's own work outside might be more compacted. And then maybe add on to that they were cut off from their families that they would normally see. That would be an outlet of managing the anxiety. Or maybe there would be a death of someone. So I can go on, and you out there can probably think of these. So I invite you to write these down, and during the discussion, you know, I would like to hear how people are seeing family leaders. And maybe even through a Bowen family systems theory lens, what does a family leader look like? And do you see the postures of leadership that he's talking about, principled, appropriate convictions that are, you know, not a floundering unit, you know, being working on differentiation of self. Are you seeing these postures as a variation in certain families? Are you seeing the postures varying within families and then between families or across families? So how does this family leader work? I know I definitely thought about it in my own family this past year with the COVID restrictions, the cutoffs, and certain deaths that occurred in my family within the year, and funerals and the way people were able to connect with the people that were dying were very different. And so where was the leadership there? So if I go in here to theoretical orientation, of course, my theoretical orientation for this research is Bowen family systems theory. And I'm really wanting to test some of the Bowen family systems theory constructs, which by definition, that's very hard because it is a system. And so you're really up against many variables and many constructs at the same time that are sort of impacting each other at the same time. And you're also up against context of by which things are happening and time. And so I just try to pull out certain parts of it and make sense of it. And so I am going to talk about Bowens quotes on page 322, and then another one on 537. And this is once again from Bowen, from Family Therapy and Clinical Practice, his book. So he describes here the difference between a closed and an open family relationship. And I think this for me, and this is just communication. So this isn't touching on physiology and many of the other postures and movements that go into relationships. But I think he gets really clear in this. The closed communication system is an automatic emotional reflex. So he's putting this as emotional reactivity to protect self from the anxiety. Hold on, I can't see this because it's in the other person. Though most people say that they avoid the taboo subjects to keep from upsetting the other person. If people could follow intellectual knowledge instead of the automatic reflex, and they could gain some control over their own reactiveness to anxiety in the other, they would be able to talk about taboo subjects in spite of the anxiety, and the relationships would move toward a more healthy openness. So I just think about when a challenge comes up in a family, who is talking about it? How is it being talked about? What is the distorted reality that might be going on that isn't being talked about? Or what are the perceptions of the people about the challenge? And those are part of the questions that I asked in the questionnaire that I developed. And here he goes on to talk about, on page 537, open family relationship interactions. They're more orderly, he calls it. And members are more comfortable with self. They're clear on their beliefs and values. They're more seasoned in communicating, thinking to other members about challenges in the family. There are clearly outlined steps to reach a goal to deal with the family challenge at hand. These individuals are experienced in the practices of bringing up taboo subjects with members and handling the other's anxiety. I just think about deaths that were going on during COVID, illnesses, psychotic breaks that might be going on at any point. And in my questionnaire, one of the questions I asked the person who was filling it out was, what challenge were you thinking about when you responded to these questions? And it was an open-ended question. And so I have to show you later tonight all of, I sort of grouped them, all the different challenges that people came up with. And there were groups, as Bowen would have, as Bowen hypothesized, there were groups of emotional, physical, and social symptoms. And then there were some other challenges that were brought up. But most people talked about more than one challenge, which was kind of interesting. So I'll show that. So they work towards, they move toward family members in ways to engage in talking about values and thinking, not judging others or avoiding the nuances of members. So this is part of Dan Paparo's model as well. And I asked a lot of questions about the perception of the person taking the questionnaire, if they thought their family did a lot of this sort of judging and avoiding, or were they able to think in the midst of challenges. And a closed system does not become an open one when an individual cries out emotionally. So Bowen is touching on this idea that when someone goes in sort of emotionally distraught, that this isn't going to make the system open necessarily, that the more seasoned person would move about it in more of a goal-oriented way. So those can be found in his book. And I know the closed communication one, this is in the chapter on death, the impact of death in a family. So I made this chart just to try and get all of the different constructs as much as I could. I did not put triangles on here, but I tried to put in, and I called this family emotional equilibrium because Dr. Bowen talks about an equilibrium in a family, but it takes all of these different constructs going on to impact or to create an equilibrium, and then how the family reacts in a disequilibrium. So I've got the open communication system up here at the top, which would be sort of, along with the higher level of differentiation of self, and which is the integration of emotional and intellectual components. And then at the bottom here, which would be lower levels of differentiation of self, higher levels of chronic anxiety, would be this closed communication system. And I think this is pretty obvious. If you have a family with lower levels of differentiation of self, with people who are coming out of the family system with less self, and then you have these heightened responses to threat and distorted realities, and higher levels of chronic anxiety that have been passed down in the families, then you're typically going to see a more chaotic closed communication system. There would be gossiping and cutoff, not a lot of talking to avoid tension. And I think these are to survive and adapt. And how does a family differentiate out of that or become more flexible and integrated and a more open communication system? I think it takes a lot of time. And here I have an example of a family diagram, and there is a symbol key here, and I'm just showing the different mechanisms that families use to manage anxiety that Dr. Bowen talked about. So with higher levels of chronic anxiety, you're going to be more stuck in the adaptive mechanisms to manage anxiety. And in families with higher levels of differentiation of self, which would be lower levels of chronic anxiety, you're going to see a little more flexibility in the ways of managing anxiety. You're going to see, less conflict, less distance, less cutoff, less focus on a child, all of those that are the mechanisms to manage anxiety. So this is really my attempt to just present an overview of how complex this theory is. And chronic anxiety is always present. The triangles are the basic building blocks of the relationships. There are these 4 emotional mechanisms to manage anxiety. And the functioning of the family is really what Bowen is focusing on. And when anxiety gets kicked up, the behaviors shift. So when you're, of course, observing anxiety families and trying to measure this, there's all these moving parts. So it really does not make for a simple observation or a simple research project. But I do invite people to do it. So Bowen theory, he calls this an organism, and he really observed his families at NIMH, and he was sort of cutting edge in this. He was able to observe these families, add and subtract from his research, and he really did a little bit at a time and would add a family member and then realize that made a difference, so then he would add more. Originally, it started with just the mothers and the children, the child with schizophrenia, and then he recognized, among other things, that it would even look different if the father was in the room and another child. So he just really observed and changed his research as he went along, which is, I think, a beautiful way to do research. And that's a little bit of what I do as a researcher as well. I don't get to observe the families as Dr. Bowen did. He had people coding, and he was in a hospital, and all of those wonderful controlled environments that he had. But I think that was key to his research, and one of the reasons why I hold it quite valid. But I'm still testing it. So let me just get in here about Bowen's view of a family with a psychotic family member. And so this is page number 79. So once again, this is early in the book during his studies at NIMH with families with schizophrenia. So a psychotic family member is functionally helpless organism without a leader and with a high level of overt anxiety. It has dealt helplessly and non-effectively with life. It has become dependent on outside experts, that includes MDs and therapists, counselors, for advice and guidance. And it is most positive decisions are made in the service of relieving anxiety of the moment, no matter how many complications this may cause tomorrow. I think this is a wonderful statement, and situates the psychotic family member not as a symptom focus, but a person who definitely has the symptoms, but is expressing them for the family that is up against challenges and has been for many generations. And that was a very different way of thinking about it, and still is today. And the family unit is regarded as a single organism, and the patient is seen as that part of the family organism through which the overt symptoms of psychosis are expressed. That's page 45, early in his book. The patient with schizophrenia is exhibiting the psychotic processes that are alive in the family emotional unit. The symptoms of psychosis are expressed, but these are part of the immature or problematic relationships and emotional processes that are going on in the family. This idea really just blows my mind away, and it's taken me years to really wrap my head around it. So what does it look like in a family when there is someone with schizophrenia? What does it look like in a family when there's a person that is presenting psychotic processes? Maybe not to the level of schizophrenia. That would be the lowest level of differentiation and the highest level of no self. But there would be a continuum. What about how a family responds to an individual with psychotic processes, or an individual who abuses alcohol or gambling? I can go down the list of symptoms. And so this would be the more extreme example of it, schizophrenia, but there would be a continuum. And I think you'll see that in the questionnaire that I developed, and the different responses, and just people's thoughts about the problems in their families. And the term emotional, I think this is a way that Bowen puts emotional, refers to the force that motivates the system and the relationship to the ways it is expressed. So I try to look at relationships and the behaviors and try to see the emotional references in that, and see it as an energy force and a life force. And this makes my research really different. Under relationship, he's describing there is this subsumed communication, there is interaction, and other relationship modalities. This is on page 158. So just giving you a scope. I think that the researcher has important aspects to this. And I just want to comment on this. As a researcher in Bowen theory, and I think in other research, in other theories, it might be the case, but I just want to highlight in Bowen family systems theory and in my research, it was valuable to me, and I think critical for me to be working on differentiation of self, myself, and in my own family, and beginning to observe indicators of the family behaviors in my own family, as well as the families that I work with, having a continued engagement with families as an observer and a coach, being aware of subjective bias in Bowen theory. So really trying to be aware of that, and then also aware of test taking attitudes and response biases from participants. So these were all things that I really focused on. And I have pictures of just different families, or I am saying that these are families in these pictures of how different families are, and that context happens, and that is critical in observing families and in my own work as a researcher. It is very important. So here I have a picture of Dr. Papero. This is on our Bowen Center website. He is really a senior faculty at the center, and he started lecturing on this probably in 2017. And some of the slides I probably made back from one of his first lectures, because I really could pick up on the 5 different dimensions that Dr. Papero would talk about as a systems model for family assessment. And he would situate it in how families respond to challenges, and with, of course, a Bowen theory lens. And so in the Handbook of Bowen Family Systems Theory, I have a picture of it. It's edited by Dr. Keller and Dr. Noon. There is a chapter in there, a systems model for family assessment. And Dr. Papero has outlined all of these dimensions in his chapter. This is a slide that I made. This is not Dr. Papero's slide, but this is the dimensional units that he presented in 2018. And I just have 5D as a 5-dimensional family unit functioning, was what I named this slide. And these were, I called them rulers. And first there was resourcefulness, and on the left would be the sort of functionally helpless family that you just heard me talk about how Dr. Bowen wrote about it in the book. And then Dan Papero brings this up. So what this functionally helpless family can look like at times up against a challenge. Not always, there's a continuum here, but then what a resourceful family would look like. And then in connectedness and integration, Dan called this, on the left would be this more cutoff family. And just think about it. How much can a family achieve really if they're up against a huge challenge? And here I have a pile-on of some rugby players, because I think that can look that way in families sometimes. Versus those families who have these broad connections, and just think about leadership and taking on challenges and what it can look like on this continuum. And this is a picture of a tree growing in a forest that is in an ecosystem that requires light and water and oxygen, everything sort of breathing and living and being together to solve problems, or to not, if there are challenges in the ecosystem that this little tree can't handle. And then tension management is what Dr. Papero calls this. There's this tension unmanaged, which can pretty much look like this, and the recognize and manage tension. Systems thinking, this conventional thinking, which would be a problem focused, a cause and effect way of thinking, treat the symptom, versus a systems thinking of everybody in the family can have a part in this. And if one person makes a change, there can be a difference. And all of that goes in there. And then the goal structure. Are there clearly developed goals? Can people see that they need to have a goal? Is there just a avoidance? Is there a distorted reality about even needing a goal? Everything's fine kind of thing. Or, or are there really clear developed goals? So on the left side would be the families that are struggling a little more at times, and maybe this varies per challenge. And so let me just point out what Dr. Papero says in his summary in the chapter here. And The schema outlined above, and this is just what he talked about throughout the chapter, so I invite people to read this, is intended to allow a clinician or a family member to formulate an impression of a family's functioning as it faces challenge. It also provides a framework for tracking progress in the family. Each of the 5 interacts with each other, and some of the subcontinua might be reflective of more than one dimension. And I'll show you some of what he calls the subcontinua. And that is what I use to develop my questions. The schema also may provide families with starting points for addressing a problem. If tension management, for example, is determined to be inadequate, a family member might begin to address his or her management of tension and his or her interactions with tense others. So he's beginning to parse out how a person can become aware of tension and maybe can begin to work on self or make changes in that. That might address some of the challenges, and it might even make for a leader in the family. Any improvement in tension management can lead to a shift in improvement in one or more of the other dimensions. Although this framework has been proposed for assessing family functioning, it appears equally applicable to the function of an individual or a non-family relationship network, an organization, a social network. As noted in its present state of development, this model cannot be considered a measurement tool of family functioning. The transformation of the schema into a measurement tool will require further research to test the accuracy of the conceptualized dimensions and the validity of the subcontinua. So right now I am trying to test and validate the accuracy of the conceptualized dimensions and the validity of the subcontinua. So what I'm doing, I did not create a scale per se. I was testing to see if the subcontinua that he created here really fell in there. That was my effort. And he goes into here the framework for assessing the family unit functioning. He states it's been difficult to develop this framework, through extrapolation from Bowen's descriptions of individual characteristics of differentiation of self, of systems thinking, of the role of leadership in the family, and the effects of anxiety, stress, and tension on the dynamically shifting family system, it becomes possible to sketch out a dimensional or continua-based framework for assessing family unit or system functioning. And the creation of a dimensional model may allow the expansion of the RDoC model to include the functioning of the family as an element in the context of the emotional well-being of a person. So, so my idea was to try and test for the dimensions. And so these are more of the subcontinua that he is talking about. So a family under resourcefulness, functionally helpless would be retreats from problems, gossips, family perceptions, focus only on the other person. And these are all from Dan's presentations. And so if many of you have seen them, I just started writing these down and taking copious notes. And this was before he wrote his chapter, and then he wrote his chapter, and that was really wonderful. And I might have already started writing my questionnaire. So, so this is connected and integrated. You can see on the left, there's low or no contact. I mean, I think these are pretty obvious. Incomplete communication. And in the broad connection, there's regular contact in nuclear family about important matters. With extended family, there's a significant degree of awareness of how others see the world, a high tolerance of other principles, high respect for differing opinions, knows how others think about important issues. This is just so relevant and is so useful, I think, for coaches or anyone who's wanting to learn more about their family to think about it on these dimensions. Goodness, hope I'm not making you dizzy. Okay, tension management, unmanaged tension. So some of you might, I think tension can be difficult to define. And so high emotional reactivity, high level of tension, unaware of anxiety or tension in self, attacking and blaming. I think this is where you begin to see the communication and the behaviors. And so it's a little easier to see it and to even code it in a family when you're observing. Defending, becoming silent, withdrawal from interactions. And then tension managed would be careful thought. So engaging the thinking, analyzing the issue, really having a consideration about the family unit, not seeing one person as a problem. If you think about it, when you're intense and your fear is up and your anxiety is up, you're really just scanning, looking for the problem. And when one can sort of calm that down, or not calm it down, think through it, I should say, because you don't even need to be calm, and to really think through it, it can make a big difference in a family if they're up against a challenge. Members recognize their own anxiety and tensions. I think so many of us know that it can be, for some people, including yourself, it can be just a lot easier to focus on the other person as, being anxious or annoying or whatever, critical. But really beginning to see what your part is in it would be a part of tension management and relating to others without attacking. And there's two more here. There's systems thinking, which was probably the hardest to break down because I think this is more woven into some of the other dimensions. So the conventional thinking would be a focus on the issues. So a focus on the symptom, a focus on, why won't my kid go to bed, or, the content of what's going on. The family conceptualizes the problem as why this happened, and not looking at the what, when, the where, and how. And other people need to change. Whereas there would be in systems thinking, attending to and tracking the process, not the content. Thinking about the whole landscape of the challenge and the focusing on how does it work? How can we get out of this? How can I be a part of it? And there's facts and analysis of the relationships. And so I'm not saying this person is a robot and that there's not emotional process going on. I think there's a lot of emotional process going on. So I think this can sound more intellectualized than I think it really is. And I'm not sure how to better capture it. And then the goal structure, this is what I'm going to show tonight. When I test it, I'm going to just present the results of this one dimension tonight. And it would be no clear goals, unaware of needing a goal, or unrealistic, unattainable goals. So you might have a distorted reality in that unattainable goal or an unrealistic goal. And then on the other side would be the realistic, attainable goals, awareness of what you're going to be up against with those, and actual goal achievement, and understanding the functioning of the relationship networks. So this is what I've extrapolated from Dan Paparo's model here. And so this is my study overview. So this is a monkey here, and this would be me thinking about, okay, what would be useful to know about any given family? What do these dimensions that I just outlined measure? How can these be tested? At first I thought, how can I apply this to clinical families? Okay, maybe I could do interviews. And I set up an interview questionnaire, and here it is right here. And it was, I think it was three pages that showed those continuum, just like I showed you on the slides. And Dr. Barbara Lehman, I did this in 2017. So this first interview section. So this would be like my first pilot of this. And Barbara Lehman agreed to try this with her clinical clients, and I was seeing some clinical clients. And I think we chose 5 people to do this with. And then she and I talked about how difficult this was and cumbersome it was. But it was useful to do it because it informed me of how to maybe hone in on this and do something a little different. And I did a lot of other structured and I tried some structured and unstructured interview type questions. And I always knew that I would continue to do observations with this questionnaire, but I did, after doing some more research on this and talking with a colleague of mine, want to do the factor analysis for the dimensions testing. So here is the actual study link on SurveyMonkey. So it looked like this: family unit problem solving practices. And I asked individuals who were in the Bowen Center programs to fill these out. And there was one center outside the Bowen Center that was doing a Bowen course, that Bowen theory course, that also agreed. And this is what they filled out. And this was the description that students participating in Bowen theory, how would they assess their family unit responses to challenges? They're about you and your family members, interact and respond to one another during family and life challenges. And I asked them to, fill this out. A little bit of information about children and highest degree of education. And then the questions are right here. There's not true at all of my family and very true of my family. And you can see here, my family blames other members when trying to solve problems. My family tackles difficult problems in a way that benefits all of its members. So And there were 40, let me see here. I have it on a slide, but I think there's 48 in all of these questions. And so each of these questions falls under a dimension. The problem I thought about were problems, and pretty much everyone put more than one problem. And so I will show you more of that data in just a little bit. Oh, I can't get out of here. Hold on. You know what? I don't know how to get out of here. Hold on. I'm going to stop. Okay. Let me just make this big. Some of this is just the windows on this thing. Okay. So let me just go into the first study results that I'm showing is the goal development dimension, which was no clear goals. I just went over this and the aware of the goals. And so what I did was I came up with 5 questions that would capture potentially this dimension. And so if you remember, my hypothesis is that the variables will, factor load on this measure of family functioning. So I'm not developing a scale. I'm just seeing if I do a factor analysis, if these fall under the dimensions that they're proposed to fall. So I'm really testing what Dr. Dan Papero is proposing in his years of observing families. And so overall variable will factor load. If the instrument is related to a particular theory, then the results should fit the theory. And so these are how I did the dimensions. So here would be tension management, for example. And these are sort of highlighted because I was doing some other data with it. But so tension management would be these numbers on the questionnaire. So, so this one had quite a bit of questions. And I just pulled these from Dan's subcontinuum and really worked and reworked these questions. I gave them to people and asked for feedback on how they found the questions to be, how readable they were, how understandable, how applicable. Here's the one for connectedness and integration. Here's my questions for resourcefulness, systems thinking right here. And then here's the goal structure one, which I'm going to go into more. So that's sort of my, how I developed that. But originally I did these 3 pilots for this questionnaire. First, I did that unstructured interview at the Bowen Center clinic, which I showed you, which was this, and with 8 families. And Dr. Lehman and I sort of decided that was really difficult and sort of cumbersome, but it was useful. And then the second, I started writing my questions like I just showed you. And then I gave them to 5 volunteers who didn't know anything about Bowen theory just to see if it made sense. And I had them give me feedback on those questions. And then I just revised and gave it back to them to see if it was more understandable. And then the third thing I did was I took that questionnaire, the one with the questions that I thought were really capturing the subcontinui on the dimensions of Paparo scale. And I took it to the Living Systems Research Group probably 3 years ago, and gave that to them and got all of their feedback and questions and changed some of the questions. And so that was version 3. And then I also presented at the Bowen Center and got some feedback from some of the final questionnaire at the center, and then put it on SurveyMonkey finally. So this was the pilot that I showed you that I have a hard copy of. It was just a little difficult to do. So when so these are the dimensions, these are the 5 dimensions. These are basically the numbers of the questions that I came up with. And some of them have more than others, you'll see. And so the reason I'm showing the goal structure one is because it's the smallest one. And but when I did the factor analysis, well, I won't tell you yet. So here is my questionnaire. I showed you a little bit of it. I tried to put it in this form so that you could see it. These are all the questions, but it was in that SurveyMonkey form, but it could be on a hard form at some point if I move on with this. So they were randomly put in there. They weren't per dimension. I had 89 responses, and I have here 47 questions. I think those are the actual dimensional questions, and then the 52 were the other questions about the person and the problem. And I employed a factor analysis to this. Where's Pete? Okay. So just to go into the results, this is one of the models that is shown a histogram, and I'm just going to talk through this briefly and just give you the overlay of it. But all of the models did show a goodness of fit, which means that it was a confirmatory factor analysis that did fit. And I started talking to Dr. Pete Buriel. Pete is what I call him. And at the time when I spoke with him, he was in Florida. And I remember when I had this idea to do this factor analysis to test these dimensions, to see if Dan Paparo's observations of all these years of families with the Bowen theory systems lens would really go under these dimensions. I knew I would probably want to do a factor analysis if I did want to test that statistically. And so I called Pete and said, I remember I was driving to Charlottesville with my probably then 3 or 4 year old. And I had to talk to Pete, and I really wanted to meet him when he was available, because he is a statistician and taught one of my statistics courses at GW. And he said to me, if you ever want future help, you contact me. And so I said, okay, do you remember when you told me this? This is that time, and I'd like to ask you a few questions. And he gave me the time. And so I remember I pulled over in a Walmart parking lot, because that was the best that I could do on that day, and prayed that my 4-year-old would cooperate in some way. And he did. And I explained to Pete these dimensions and what I was thinking, and if I did these questions, and it would be confirming Dr. Paparo's observations that I really thought were sort of the qualitative part of, or the observational part of the research. And he agreed that I could definitely do that, but he said I would probably need, about 80 people, and he would help me with this. And so once he was on board with me, that was really great. And I really didn't want to do the factor analysis by myself. I could have, but it would have taken me a long time. And so I, once the results were in, I sent my spreadsheet that was very clean and tidy to an old professor of mine, the way he had showed me to do it. And he began to work with me on the factor analysis. And this was just before the Texas had the whole shutdown. He was living in Texas, and so there was this water and a really awful disaster in Texas. And even through that, he was working with me and sending me the results. And so this is, I chose a picture of this girl because this is kind of what I experienced in getting this data. And he was not surprised that the questions were factor loaded and relating to one another under these dimensions, because he thought, yeah, the questions, they made sense. I think he was applying them to his own family. And he has a background in some counseling and education, and got his statistics degree from University of Maryland. And so has been around working with counseling and psychology and education researchers. And so what this diagram shows you here is that this is the error variances. So you want these to be sort of low. And so this means that with each of these questions, so family would be the first question that I asked under goal structure, and F shape was just a variable that we gave the second question, and this would be the third, and this would be the fourth, and this would be the fifth. So we were looking to see the relationship or the loading, that if one person answered a certain way to F shape, would they answer a certain way to this one and this one and this one and this one. And so there's all these matrices that go on and connections that go on. But basically, for the let me get my so for something like F shape here that has a 0.86, what this is telling me is that for this factor, for the L1 factor, for every one standard deviation increase in this goal structure, the question that had to do with shaping the goals to meet the family needs went up 0.86 of a point. So that there would be this relationship here, and that it would all go into this one dimension or this one factor. So when we did this for every single dimension, and each dimension has its own hypothesis and its own test, it's so there were 5 different of these that all of them had showed a fairly similar diagram, and all of them had a goodness of fit individually, and then an overall goodness of fit model. So what does this mean now? This just means that I need to write this up, and he's still working with me on some of the results. These literally just came in. And then what I'd like to do next is compare this to people who did fill out the measure, compare it in observing. So can this be given at different time periods of a coaching relationship to see how it changes? I would think it would change. I don't think this is rigid or constant. And so the way I would use it would be just a way to engage the family and observe the family, and see how each dimension using some of those questions changes or doesn't change, or if it really is useful if I'm observing the family. Is it really valid and reliable? So some of the feedback that I got from people when I gave them the questionnaire was, how are you going to compare people's questions if all of their challenges are different? And, like, how are you going to compare a respondent who's saying their challenge is dealing with a dying husband versus someone who says their challenge is a work conflict or something? And my thinking was that that I just wanted to know how the family was responding to challenge, to what that person's perception of that family response to challenge. And that's not the entire family. So that would be my one limitation. I didn't give this questionnaire to every single person in the family, and I'm not looking to compare them right now. But for me, it would tell me something about a family if the way they respond to one challenge, I still would know potentially how they could respond to another one. So I just think that there would be similar movements that families would make no matter what the challenge was. But so I always knew that was going to be a difficulty, but I kind of just wanted to test it to see how it would go. And so I wrote the question in: when you thought about these questions, what challenge? And this is what they wrote. Everybody wrote in all of these different things, and I tried to group them. I have 2 pages, but this is one page. I put this in a business, money, career, job, and people gave more than one. So this person, one person could have given one from here and one from here and one from here. But these are all the issues that people talked about and challenges. Medical symptoms. And once again, this really covered all of the symptoms that Bowen would talk about families being up against. Here's depression, schizophrenia, death. Here's just family relationship issues and events. And these are people who are studying Bowen theory. So they might be using language like differentiation of self with a partner. So not many people commented on family events, but there were a lot in just family relationship issues and events. Here's someone, little family of origin interactions and extended family. Now, someone else outside of Bowen Theory training program or a conference might not even notice that. So this is clearly a sample of a population interested in Bowen Theory. And so I think I've gone over, you know, the limitations. It is a questionnaire. There's response biases. There's test taker attitudes. We all want to sort of look good to somebody. I tried to make this as confidential as possible. The person didn't put their name on there. There can be fake good or fake bad responses. I mean, I'm truly just capturing the person's perception, but that to me is important. I want to know people's perceptions. I could broaden it and give it to, you know, 4 people in a family and look at the comparison. And that would be a completely different study. And so I think that also checking for cultural bias, being fair, having the questions fair and non-offensive, not really saying what I'm asking for, trying to have a little bit of a hidden agenda when I'm asking a question so that people aren't trying to give fake good answers or fake bad. So those are the limitations. The benefits for me were just being able to assess the family, the person's perception. When I didn't do an interview, I thought there was a potential for less relationship fusion than when I'm talking with someone in an interview. But I do want to compare someone taking this and then when I observe them. And some of these people I do know, and I even took the questionnaire over and over myself when a family challenge would come up. And so used it on my own family, which had plenty of challenges over the past 3 years. And so treatment validity, one of the benefits, do the results from the test make a difference in the treatment? And if the test results are useful, if the results make a difference in the counseling coaching process, then the test could be said to have treatment validity. So I think this could be used in a coaching relationship if the coach is also observing and talking about it. It's not a standalone type thing. So I'm going to stop there, and I think I went over everything. And I would like to open it up for discussion. And I'm going to be running the discussion. And I see, okay. And so I see Rebecca Franklin.
Hi. Great work on what you're doing. I think this is going to be really, really helpful to people. But a question I had as I was looking through some of your slides is, what if there is a lot of variability on how different family members respond to challenges? Like, for example, on the tension management dimension. And when I was looking at that, I would literally, like, my parents are polar opposites, right? And if I were filling out this survey, I wouldn't even know what to do. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I had one person, so I had 2 people, one person out of the 89 give me feedback that it was difficult to respond because of that it would depend on if they were thinking about their extended family, if they were thinking about their nuclear family. I knew that was going to come up, but I also knew that there would be people that would be able to sort of give this average or just their perception. I mean, but I think there are people that have a hard time with doing that. And I think that can just come with the family. I knew that was going to come up. So I did have one person say that. And then but they did complete the measure. And then I had one person say they couldn't do the measure because they just could not make sense of that. And so that was just a limitation. And I think what I would do with, I think what's most useful is to try and do that as an interview. But I don't know, what are you thinking?
I think it would be interesting to have, in situations like that, especially to maybe have, if you have the, the genogram and whoever you've identified on that in terms of the family that's being focused on, if you, whoever it is that's filling out the survey, if you had them perhaps fill it out for certain person, for each person, and then find a way to aggregate those scores.
Right.
For a score for the family as a whole. Yes,
I thought about all of those. Can I give it to more? And actually, Pete, the statistics person that I'm working with said, are any of these results from people in the same family? And I thought, no, but if you could do that, that would be great, Pete. And so I think we can go back and give it to couples. And I think he has an idea of what that might look like. I'm not clear on if that would be useful for me, but I think that is one way to go about it. Those were my limitations. I only asked one person. It was only that person's perception. And this idea of, and Dan Paparo has lectured on this before, is who is the family? I mean, when I wrote the directions, I was asking people, tell me how your family responds to challenges. And then I thought, oh my God, do I have to spell out who the family is? And that's just, I think that's something to be researched. Who do people consider to be their family? And I think that came up in this, and it came up in another study that I did interviewing mothers and asking them about their family relationships, and some of them talked about friends as kind of family. So I think that that was in my head, and it's just there.
Yeah, I mean, it could probably work with any small emotional system, regardless of whether they're related.
Right, maybe. I mean, I think family members have a multi-generational sort of passing on an inheritance of emotional patterns. That's what I think. But yeah, if I'm asking someone who they think their family is, then I have to consider that in a questionnaire. But you're right. If I'm doing a family diagram, I'm doing it, and I can see that. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Carrie, there was a question that came in through the chat box. I'm not sure if you noticed.
Lance Simpkins, do you want to ask that? Maybe, would there be value in comparing individual scores for their nuclear family separate from? Yeah, so I think that, let me think about that, comparing how someone responds in their nuclear family to their extended family. So that would be interesting, of course. I think part of the sort of overall family functioning would be how much interaction and engagement there is between these two families. And so I think that would be interesting to see if there is a lot of cutoff, how different that could be. I'm sure it is different. But I think that would be really interesting. I don't know how to do that because I didn't give scores for this. This wasn't really a scoring type questionnaire. This was just testing the continua to see if they fell under the dimensions. But I think that when I thought about my family, I'm getting a reverb. Someone needs to mute. That I had a little bit of a hard time with that too. But once I started thinking about more challenges, I could really give an overall, landscape of the responses. But I think that's a great idea. You could look at even your own family, Lance. I don't know where you are, but you could even look at your own family and compare. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, sorry, I was having an audio issue. I was connected to a speaker. No, just I thought it would be interesting to look for just perception in the difference in functioning in one's own nuclear family, extended family, and I think as we all recognize, there can be real differences in functioning, but the level of differentiation should still be relevant. And I think it would be probably, I think maybe create insight into the openness of the clarity of the issues in one's family by looking at them separately and then as a total picture. I was just thinking on the fly that might be valuable.
Yeah, I think it would be. When I first thought about that, I thought, okay, how do I respond to my nuclear family? And I think I would have a tendency to maybe rate it better than some of my extended family. But when I really studied it and thought about the families, I really couldn't separate them. And my nuclear family wasn't really doing all that much better than the extended family. But at first it did seem like it. So I think part of the value in these questions is one's ability to really think about his or her part in the system, and to really think about how different leaders can rise up in a family. And also, there can be decisions that families make that might not look that great to a counselor or a coach or to a neighbor, but how that is an adaptive mechanism for a family to survive. And I think that's the key to this not being a scale, because I think families have these adaptive mechanisms, to survive, and that, I believe, is grounded in differentiation of self and in the family's level of differentiation of self. And so then you're back to trying to measure differentiation of self in that scale. And that I was not willing to take on. I really thought the opportunity in these questions and in these dimensions was the ability to talk to a family about a challenge, and to just hear one person's perceptions, and if you can, as many as you can. I work with I work with a mom who came to me a couple years ago and was really struggling with her marriage, but also her son coming out of the closet. So this was a challenge for her. And then I worked with her for a while, and she read about differentiation of self and Bowen theory and this challenge of, what this was going to bring for her life. And then her son went to college, and she asked if I would meet with him too. And I started meeting with him, and I just had a completely different perspective from him on what it was like in coming out and all this sort of thing. And then I can talk, and then she invites the husband to come, and then I get his perspective. And so it's just when you can get the more people and really more of what's going on, I think for a coach and for a researcher, you're just going to learn more, and you're going to better understand the system. But I think in the other thing in this questionnaire that I think, or just these questions, I mean, you can go through as a coach and sort of ask these questions to someone and see how that works for you. Is that useful? Is it not? And I think Living Systems, I know that they've done some pilots like that and observed it. And I think you can do that. But I just really wanted to do the questionnaire to see if I could work on some statistics and see this come through.
There there's a question from Monica Clark, if you'd like to share.
Okay.
Monica.
I don't see it in the chat. Do you want to, Monica?
Hi, sure, I can write it. Let me go to my question and then I'll, here it is. Family definition is changing, and I've seen it happen really in the last 20 years, especially. So I think first we have to ask the question about family relationships, or if families are created from friendships, just in light of your survey. And so what I'm most interested in, let me get to my question, sorry. What I'm most interested in is passing on a legacy to families in one way or the other, and then also resolving conflict in families per your survey and per your work that you're doing. And it appears to me that the millennial generation sees family differently, and it's dramatically different than the boomer generation. So what I am seeing is younger adults cutting off family members and seeing them as toxic. And that's the solution, that they're toxic family members, and so I need to cut them off. And how can this survey reframe conflict in light of that shift?
I don't know. I would actually like to hear more from you about what your thinking is, but let me see if I can take a stab at this. I think that your comment about the generational differences in how people are reacting to the family. I think like the younger are cutting off and saying, I don't want to engage this person, even parents, because they're toxic. So there's this toxic word that's out there, and there is a whole culture or a whole, I don't know, a huge part of the social media and the literature out there on, you know, how and why you should cut off from your family who are toxic. So there's really a lot of support out there for people that make that decision. So I think that is more sort of outward because of maybe social media, but I think even previous generations cut off from their families. They might not have called them toxic because they might have known better to say that. But I think, I don't know, I haven't done this research. This will be really interesting. I don't know if cutoff has increased in this newer generation. It may have, but I think previous generations cut off, but they maybe just didn't talk about it. You know, they would move really far away and say, you know, they just wouldn't say anything. I mean, I'm just thinking about even my own parents moved really far away and were very emotionally distant, and somewhat will really cut off from some of their family. But they didn't call them toxic. You know, they said they had problems. But so I think it's gone on for years. I don't know if the generation today just can get more support from it, or just feel freer to say that about their parents. And I think that could be a change for sure. As far as the survey being, you know, I think there are questions in there about having respect for others and listening to others, even when you don't agree, not, you know, judging and being open. And I think, you know, I don't know how much that would move someone when they're answering it, but it might get them thinking about, you know, someone who comes up with a different opinion than they do, or a different way of seeing things in a family. And I think that's really a lot of what Bowen theory has been about for me and for a lot of people, that, you know, differentiation of self is about seeing people as adults that are just trying to do their best to get through this life. And when one can, you know, come out of a family with a little bit more of a self and be less judging, and see even a parent or a grandparent as an adult and what they were up against. And maybe, you know, answering some of these questions will just give someone a different way of thinking about the challenges. Or it could just be more fire. You know, it could just light the fire a little more. But I think the idea, and I think that's what Bowen family systems theory is about. I mean, I don't tell people, if they say I cut off from my parent because they're toxic, I certainly don't say, oh, you shouldn't do that, you know, because I try to respect the need for distance that some people have. And that is sometimes, you know, the best way that they figured out how to deal with that challenging member. So that's that culture out there that calls, you know, certain people toxic. It's hard. I mean, I think there are some people that, you know, it's probably best to stay away from. I mean, I think that can be a mechanism that is adaptive, but I think that might be adaptive and for survival. But I think if one looks at families where there is a lot of cutoff, I don't, and you can do this study, but I think that those people probably don't come out in the end, and you're not going to see as much or as many leaders or opportunities for leaders in the family when there's that much cutoff. I mean, I just think there's value in having some sort of connections and being able to talk with certain people. And this whole thing about who the family is, I mean, I just think that's another really big question, who the family is. Did you want to say anything more?
So I think that's all a very, that adds to the whole conversation. I think there just needs to be a conversation about that, you know, to reframe kind of where we are in terms of what is a family, you know, who is my family, how can I resolve conflict in my family? Because I think there's a real spectrum of resolution that, and I'm speaking personally, that I had with my aging parents. And so I think that's really valuable, that I found resolution and forgiveness and redemption and a lot of, mostly resolution with my aging parents. And I'm really glad I went through that. It was personally character building and really healed a lot of things in me. So I just feel like there is a conversation to be had about, you know, if there's an opportunity to find resolution with a family member, then I would like to see it encouraged. So rather than this whole other conversation of like the best thing to do is just to cut this person off because they're toxic. And I think, you know, I think there's a larger conversation around all of that, especially in light of your survey, which I think is really brilliant. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dan Papero came up with the dimensions. I'm testing. Thank you. Is Andrea next? Andrea Shara? How much subjectivity is there in the answers? Is there some way to separate out opinions and guesses? Yeah, I think the way I'd like to do this next is to select a few people randomly and give them the interview, but also do some, give them the questionnaire, but also do some interviewing with them to see if what they're saying is opinion or guesses or facts. Absolutely. Do you want to say anything more about that? Is there a way?
No, that's great. Good job. Very good. Yeah. The only other thing I was trying to say is, you know, do people understand that there is an emotional system that's influencing them? You know, I don't know if that's a secret question that you put in the middle so nobody notices it that much until they're trying to answer it. But
yeah,
I don't know how people realize that.
Yeah, I think that would sort of test for people's awareness of how moved one is and how moved humans are by emotional reactivity versus, you know, thoughtful thinking. I mean, you know, really thinking. And I think that would get to how aware someone is of that. Would be a good question. I mean,
I've always got
any questions. Thank you, Andre.
They answered a lot of them for me, but thank you.
Sure. Linda McKay, wait, hold on. Okay, I think she's next. Reliability and validity. Is the questionnaire available now for use with a clinical population? Once I write it up, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with the, there you are. Once I write this up, I will have the questionnaire available for use if one would like to use it. Sure. Mhm. I took on this job as director of the Bowen Center, so I have to get my priorities in order here. And I thought by presenting this online that I would take a week this summer and write this up.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
We've got something going through ethics, so I imagine it won't be in time for that application then. We've been generously shared by Dr. Cleaver, his nuclear family functioning scale, and but really, I mean, really interested also in what this questionnaire provides. Yeah, thank you.
What I said while I was muted was, I will email you, Linda. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know who asked this one question. I would imagine that defining family and even family of origin would be imperative for many individuals. Mm-hmm. Adoptive, does whoever wrote that, do you want to comment? Okay. I'll move on and we can come back. Maybe add a measure of metacognition. Who said that? From Rebecca, maybe? Let me see. Rebecca Franklin. You'll have to tell me more about metacognition.
Yeah, that was just in reference to Andrea's question about the subjectivity and all.
Can you tell me more what you're thinking?
Well, it was when she said something about how to, to what extent are they aware of their, awareness of what's going on in the family, and metacognition would be like a construct to measure that potentially. Right, because like if you throw in a few, like if there's a validated, I haven't looked it up, but if there's like a validated scale on metacognition already, and you toss a few questions of those questions in there randomly, it might help with that.
Got it. I'll look up metacognition because
it's basically knowing the way my former supervisor described it, knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know.
Oh. That ought to be interesting. Thank you. Have about 6 minutes.
Do you see Dan Paparo's hand?
No, I don't. Dan Paparo.
CAFO.
Thank you.
It's because my hand blends into the background. Thanks, Carrie. I appreciate the effort you put into this. I put it out there and you and a few others have picked it up and worked on seeing what you could do with this. I put this out there primarily because I don't think the field has begun to grapple yet with the magnanimity, really, the expansive thinking that Dr. Bowen put into this idea of the family as an organism. The field still circles around the individual or around two-person relationships and seems to be blind to this, the evolutionary basis of context in determining behavior. Dr. Bowen's theory is in many ways a theory about human adaptation and variation in human adaptation upon which natural selection works. The question of toxicity is an interesting one. periodically the field cycles through recommending that people avoid their families. This is just another iteration of something that seems to come up about every 10 years and gets a certain level of popularity in it. That's one of the things that happens when you've been around too long. You see the same ideas cycle over and over and over again. But if you thought about an adaptation is only in the here and now, and it may be an effective adaptation at the moment, but carry with it consequences that lead to impaired adaptive capacity downrange. The question of what is a family is certainly one that interests me. Dr. Bowen had a very simple definition for a family that he threw out one day. I don't think he ever wrote it down. Now, I've never found it in his writing, let me say it that way, but he threw it out in the meeting one day, which was the total number of organisms connected to an emotional nucleus, which bypasses the idea of biological kinship, which is where most social scientists get stuck in it. And then the evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar, whose work is really quite brilliant in many ways, has begun to look at group size in human functioning and talks about layers of social connectedness. The most connected layer involves about 5 individuals, and then to 15 and so on. I don't know whether he's right about that or not, although he has a tremendous amount of research coming out of primatology to suggest that this appears to be so. All I'm trying to get at is there's a level of complexity beyond the way clinicians are thinking about this that has the capacity to change the way we understand human behavior. It moves toward what Bowen was calling a science of the human, which we have not arrived at yet. And it spans the disciplines in many ways, which is what makes it so difficult to grapple with it. I've been at it for close to 45 years now, and I finally am beginning to understand what Bowen was talking about. Why does it take so damn long? I don't know. Anyway, I just wanted to say thank you, Carrie, for working on this, and for the Living Systems group, some of whom are on here today. And Dr. Mackay spoke up a moment ago. One of the versions of this began in my sabbatical in Sydney when listening to Dr. Mackay and others in the Family Systems program in Sydney wrestle with what was complex trauma and turning up in the hospital system in Australia, and the helplessness of the clinicians in dealing with it was striking. And it began to be clear to me that if the clinicians are functioning helplessly, what's the family supposed to do? Mm-hmm. And then beginning to think about, well, what would it take for a clinician to begin to think about his or her own functioning in relationship to the functional helplessness of the family unit? Anyway, those were just some of the big thoughts on it. I just mainly just wanted to, I didn't do it very well, to point out that there is a big evolutionary picture going on here, which is being driven by vast overpopulation on our planet. And that the family unit remains the most functional unit of adaptation for the human species. And how it functions has a great deal to do with how societies function. The interface is both ways. Societies impact or influence families, but families influence societies as well. And when family functioning can improve, the potential for society to improve increases significantly. From family to community, from community to larger grouping, from larger grouping to bigger social units, all the way up to the level of the global relationship system of which we're all a part. And to try to convey the importance of this, particularly at this point, where we're looking at Darwinian fitness in play, affecting the human population, seems to me to be one of the most important messages that Dr. Bowen left for the future. And how to get that out there in a way that somehow makes sense to at least a few people has been the challenge. Anyway, let me stop, Carrie. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Well, that is, I didn't get to Sandra Caffo. Can you email me, please? Sandra, I can send you.
Sure.
Email.
No problem.
It's C. Collier at the Bowen Center. I really invite people to email me, and I thank everyone for coming in June, and I look forward to seeing people the next program year for these. These have been full. Oh, and Anne's going, Anne Curran. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carrie. Dr. Collier, it was quite a fascinating piece of work. And it certainly evolved, as I've heard you talk about it, into a very complicated piece of research that hopefully will lend a lot to a lot of people, clinicians in particular. But I wanted also to mention tomorrow we have at the clinical conference, Mr. Randall Frost, who's going to be talking about the integration of Bowen theory and family psychotherapy. Those who are interested who have not registered, it does require a registration fee, but you have up to 2 hours prior to the meeting, which begins at 9:30, to register if you'd like to do that. Mr. Frost is a long-term Bowen theory researcher, so it should be a most interesting day. Thank you all. Come back in the fall. Look forward to seeing you. Good night.
Thank you, Anne.